The Wyoming Territory in 1876 was a land that seemed to exist at the very edge of God's patience. Dust devils danced across the barren plains like angry spirits, and the wind carried with it the scent of sage and the promise of violence. It was a place where the line between civilization and wilderness blurred like heat mirages on the horizon, where white settlers carved out their claims with rifle and rope, while the Lakota fought to hold on to what had been theirs since time immemorial. Catherine Whitlow stood at the kitchen window of the sprawling ranch house, watching the morning sun paint the distant hills the color of dried blood. At 24, she possessed the kind of quiet beauty that frontier life had not yet managed to wear away. Auburn hair that caught fire in the sunlight, green eyes that held depths of sorrow and longing, and hands that remained soft despite the harsh demands of her daily existence. 2 years had passed since the mining accident that claimed her husband Thomas, crushing him beneath a collapsed timber in the silver mine he'd been so certain would make their fortune. Now she lived under the roof and rule of his father, Jeremiah Whitlow, a man whose weathered face seemed carved from the same unforgiving stone as the land he'd claimed. "Catherine," came the gruff voice from behind her. She turned to see her father-in-law filling the doorway, his gray beard neatly trimmed, his eyes holding that familiar mixture of duty and impatience. "Elijah Blackmore will be calling on you this afternoon." Her stomach tightened at the name. Elijah Blackmore, territorial administrator, widower, and by all accounts a man who collected things rather than loved them. His first wife had died in childbirth 3 years prior, leaving him with a son he barely acknowledged and a hunger for social position that a second marriage to the right woman might satisfy. "I haven't agreed to receive his calls," Catherine said quietly, her fingers worrying the fabric of her simple brown dress. Jeremiah's expression hardened. "You're a widow living on my charity. Girl, Thomas is gone, and you've got no children to show for the marriage. Blackmore is offering you a future, a respectable one." Catherine bit back the words that rose in her throat. There was no point in arguing with a man who saw women as livestock to be traded when they'd outlived their usefulness. Instead, she nodded and returned her gaze to the window, where a red-tailed hawk circled high above the scrub grass. "I'm going into town for supplies," she said, "and I need to gather some herbs from the eastern ridge." Jeremiah grunted his approval. Catherine knew he cared little for her activities as long as they didn't interfere with his plans for her future. She also knew he was unaware that her herb-gathering expeditions often took her far beyond the eastern ridge, to the very borders of Lakota territory where danger and freedom walked hand in hand. An hour later, Catherine rode out on her mare, Duchess, with a canvas bag slung over her shoulder and a leather-bound book tucked safely in her saddlebag. Reading was her secret vice, poetry and novels that painted pictures of worlds beyond the endless expanse of sagebrush and suffering. Today she carried Tennyson, his words about love and loss speaking to something deep in her heart. The eastern ridge rose like a sleeping giant from the prairie floor, its rocky face scarred by wind and weather. Catherine had discovered a narrow trail that wound through the stones to a hidden meadow where wildflowers bloomed in defiance of the harsh climate. It was here she came when the walls of the ranch house threatened to suffocate her, when Jeremiah's plans pressed down on her like a physical weight. She dismounted near a cluster of juniper trees and began gathering the wild mint that grew in the shade. The work was peaceful, meditative, and for a while she could pretend she was simply a woman collecting herbs, not a piece of property being negotiated over by men who saw her as nothing more than a vessel for their ambitions. The first sign of trouble came when Duchess raised her head sharply, ears pricked forward in alarm. Catherine looked up to see a wall of dust rolling across the prairie like a brown tsunami. In the distance, she could hear the low rumble that meant this was no ordinary dust devil. This was one of the fierce storms that could strip paint from wood and blind a rider in minutes. She moved quickly to secure her horse, but Duchess was already spooked by the approaching tempest. As Catherine reached for the reins, a particularly strong gust of wind sent her hat spinning away like a tumbleweed. The mare shied violently, and Catherine felt herself falling, the world tilting sideways as her head struck the rocky ground. The last thing she remembered was the taste of dust in her mouth and the sound of thunder without rain. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments, the scent of wood smoke and sage, the softness of fur beneath her cheek, the steady rhythm of someone breathing nearby. Catherine's eyes fluttered open to find herself lying on a bed of buffalo hides inside what appeared to be a makeshift shelter. Animal skins stretched over a framework of wooden poles created walls that filtered the light to a warm amber glow. She sat up carefully, her head throbbing, and found herself looking into the darkest eyes she had ever seen. The man sitting beside her fire was Lakota. She could tell from the beadwork on his shirt and the way his long black hair was braided with leather cord. He was perhaps 30 years of age, with sharp cheekbones and a mouth that looked as if it had forgotten how to smile. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, and she could see other marks on his arms that spoke of violence survived. "You were hurt," he said in English, his voice carrying only the slightest accent. "I brought you here." Catherine pulled the buffalo robe closer around her shoulders, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she was. This man could kill her without effort, could do far worse things that her father-in-law's warnings had taught her to fear about savages. Yet, something in his manner, the way he kept his distance, the careful neutrality of his expression, suggested that harm was not his intention. "My horse," she managed to say. "Safe. The storm has passed, but soldiers patrol the roads. It is not safe for you to travel yet." The words carried implications that made her heart race. If soldiers were looking for her, if she had been missing long enough for search parties to form, then questions would be asked about where she had been and who had helped her, questions that could lead to violence for both of them. "What is your name?" she asked. He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Tahu Red Elk, and you are the widow from the Whitlow Ranch." It wasn't a question. He knew who she was, which meant he understood exactly how dangerous it was to help her. Yet here she sat, alive and cared for, in defiance of everything she had been taught about the savagery of his people. "Catherine," she said simply. "Catherine Whitlow." Tahu nodded and turned his attention to the fire, adding another piece of wood to the flames. In the growing light, she could see more details of their shelter. A parfleche bag decorated with painted symbols, a rifle propped carefully against the wall, and scattered around the edges, the tools of a man who lived by hunting and fighting. "Why did you help me?" she asked. His dark eyes found hers again, and for a moment she saw something flicker in their depths. Pain, perhaps, or a grief so deep it had worn smooth like a river stone. "Because you are dying," he said simply, "and I have seen enough death." The words hung between them like smoke from the fire, heavy with meaning she couldn't quite grasp. Catherine found herself studying his face, noting the lines of weariness around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried themselves as if bearing an invisible weight. This was a man who had fought battles beyond her imagining, who had lost things that could never be replaced. "The scar," she said softly, then immediately regretted the intrusion. Tahu's hand moved unconsciously to his cheek. "Fort Robinson," he said. "2 summers ago. They came for our children, to take them to their schools. My sister's boy. He was only 7. His voice trailed off, and Catherine understood that some stories were too painful to tell to strangers. They sat in silence as the fire crackled between them. 2 people from different worlds thrown together by chance and storm. Outside, she could hear the wind still sighing through the rocks, carrying with it the scent of rain that might never come. "I should go," Catherine said finally, though something deep inside her recoiled at the thought of returning to the ranch house, to Jeremiah's plans and Elijah Blackmore's calculating eyes. "Not yet," Tahu said firmly. "The patrols will continue until dark. Tomorrow, perhaps." Another night in this strange sanctuary. Another night away from the life that awaited her like a trap. Catherine closed her eyes and let herself imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to simply disappear into this wild country, to become someone other than the widow Whitlow, the woman being bartered away for respectability and social standing. When she opened her eyes, She found Tahu watching her with an expression she couldn't read. In his dark gaze, she saw something that made her breath catch. Not the lustful hunger she had learned to expect from men, but something deeper and more dangerous. Recognition, perhaps. The look of someone who understood what it meant to be trapped by circumstances beyond their control. "Tell me about your husband," he said quietly. And somehow, sitting in that shelter made of hide and hope, with a man who was supposed to be her enemy, Catherine found herself speaking of things she had never told anyone, of Thomas's gentle hands and broken dreams, of the loneliness that had followed her like a shadow since his death, and of the fear that she would spend the rest of her life as nothing more than another man's possession. Outside, the wind continued its ancient song, and inside, two wounded souls began the dangerous dance of understanding. Catherine returned to the Whitlow ranch as the sun was setting on the second day, her absence explained by the storm and a story about taking shelter in a line shack on the eastern boundary. Jeremiah accepted her account with the distracted air of a man whose mind was occupied with more pressing matters, namely, the formal courtship that was about to begin. "Blackmore's been asking after you," he said as she unsaddled Duchess in the barn. "Seems mighty concerned about your welfare." Catherine said nothing, focusing on the familiar ritual of caring for her horse. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment of those 2 days in Tahu's shelter. She could still feel the weight of his dark eyes upon her, still hear the quiet cadence of his voice as he spoke of losses that had shaped him like wind-shaped stone. When she closed her eyes, she could smell the wood smoke and sage, could feel the softness of buffalo hide beneath her fingers. "He'll be calling tomorrow evening," Jeremiah continued. "I expect you to receive him properly." That night, Catherine lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling beams Thomas had cut and fitted with his own hands. The room felt smaller than ever, the walls pressing in like a coffin built for the living. She thought of Tahu sleeping under the stars, free despite all the forces arrayed against his people, and wondered what it would be like to live without walls, without expectations, without the suffocating weight of respectability. Elijah Blackmore arrived the following evening precisely at 7 o'clock, as if punctuality were a virtue that could compensate for all other shortcomings. He was a man of medium height and build, with thinning brown hair combed carefully over his scalp, and pale eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. His suit was expensive but ill-fitting, giving him the appearance of a boy dressed in his father's clothes. "Mrs. Whitlow," he said, removing his hat with practiced courtesy. "I trust you've recovered from your ordeal during the storm." "Completely. Mr. Blackmore, thank you for your concern." They sat in the parlor while Jeremiah busied himself with papers at his desk, a transparent chaperone who made no effort to disguise his approval of the proceedings. Elijah spoke of his work with the territorial administration, of his plans for expansion of the mining operations, of his son who was being educated back east. He spoke, Catherine noticed, as if their marriage were already a settled matter. "A woman in your position needs security," he said, leaning forward slightly. "I can provide that. A fine house in town, servants, a position in society that befits a lady of refinement." Catherine nodded at appropriate intervals, but her mind kept drifting to a shelter made of hide and poles, to conversations by firelight that had revealed more truth in 2 days than she had heard in 2 years of proper society. "You seem distracted, my dear," Elijah said, his pale eyes narrowing slightly. "Perhaps the storm affected you more than you care to admit." "I'm simply tired, Mr. Blackmore. It's been a trying few days." "Of course." His smile was thin, calculating. "Perhaps you'd benefit from less solitary riding. A woman alone on these plains. Well, there are dangers you may not fully appreciate." Something in his tone made her skin crawl, though she couldn't say exactly why. "I've been riding these lands for years without incident. Times are changing. Mrs. Whitlow, the Indian troubles are growing worse. Just last week, a surveyor was found dead near Willow Creek, scalped." He paused, watching her reaction carefully. "A woman of your refinement shouldn't be exposed to such brutalities." Catherine kept her expression neutral, but inwardly she recoiled from the casual way he spoke of violence, from the assumption that she was too delicate to understand the realities of frontier life. She thought of Tahu's scarred hands as he tended her injury, of the gentleness in his touch, despite all the reasons he had to hate her people. The courtship continued over the following weeks with all the mechanical precision of a business transaction. Elijah called twice weekly, bringing small gifts, a cameo brooch, a book of devotional poetry, gloves of soft leather that felt like shackles around her wrists. He spoke of wedding plans as if her consent were a mere formality, discussing the ceremony, the guest list, the renovations he planned for his house to accommodate a wife. Catherine found herself agreeing to everything while meaning nothing, her true self hidden away like contraband, but even as she played the role of dutiful widow, accepting salvation through remarriage. Her thoughts turned constantly to the Eastern Ridge, to the hidden places beyond the reach of proper society. 3 weeks after the storm, she could stand it no longer. She saddled Duchess before dawn, telling herself she was only going to gather herbs for Mrs. Patterson, whose rheumatism had been acting up. It was a reasonable errand, a proper excuse. The fact that her route took her deep into the borderlands was merely coincidence. She found him near the same meadow where she had been gathering mint, as if he had been waiting for her. Tahu stood beside his horse, a magnificent paint stallion that seemed carved from wind and shadow. He wore buckskins today instead of the beaded shirt, and his hair hung loose around his shoulders like a dark river. "You came back," he said simply. "I had to." The words were out before she could stop them, carrying more truth than she had intended to reveal. They looked at each other across the space of 20 feet and 1,000 differences, and Catherine felt something shift in her chest, like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut. This was dangerous, more dangerous than storms or soldiers or the gossip of small-minded people. This was the kind of danger that could destroy lives. "Walk with me," Tahu said. They left their horses to graze and followed a deer trail that wound between the junipers. Catherine had never been this deep into the borderlands, and she marveled at the wildflowers that bloomed in hidden crevices, at the way the light played across the red stone cliffs. Everything here was alive in a way that the civilized world had forgotten. "Tell me about your people," she said as they paused beside a natural spring. Tahu was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes scanning the horizon. "What do you want to know?" "Everything, what it was like before the troubles." He began to speak then, his voice taking on the rhythm of ancient stories. He told her of summers when the buffalo ran like thunder across the plains, of winters when the people gathered in the sheltered valleys to share stories and dream of spring. He spoke of his grandmother, who had taught him to read the signs in smoke and clouds, and of his father, who had died defending a village from soldiers who came in the name of peace. "We lived with the land instead of on it," he said. "Everything was connected, the grass, the buffalo, the wind, the people. Now," he gestured toward the distant smoke of the settlements, "now everything is broken into pieces, and the pieces war against each other." Catherine found herself telling him about Thomas, about the dreams they had shared and the loneliness that had followed his death like a shadow. She spoke of Elijah's courtship, of the trap closing around her, of the feeling that she was slowly disappearing into the role others had written for her. "You could leave," Tahu said quietly. "Where would I go? What would I do?" The questions came out sharper than she intended, born of frustration with her own helplessness. "There are places," he said, "beyond the reach of their laws. People who would accept you if you chose to live differently." The possibility hung between them like a bridge she didn't dare cross. To leave everything, to abandon the safety of respectability for the uncertain freedom of the wilderness. It was impossible, wasn't it? They met again a week later, and then again. Catherine told herself she was being foolish, that these encounters served no purpose except to make her dissatisfaction with her prescribed life more acute. But she could not stay away. Tahu had become like water to someone dying of thirst, essential, life-giving, impossible to resist. Their conversations ranged over everything and nothing. He told her Lakota words for the plants she gathered, and she shared passages from her books, reading poetry aloud while he listened with the stillness of someone accustomed to hearing truth in unexpected places. They spoke of their different worlds with the fascination of explorers discovering new continents. It was during their fourth meeting that the storm caught them. They had ventured farther than usual, following a canyon that cut deep into the red rock country. The rain began as a light sprinkle, but quickly intensified into the kind of downpour that turned dry washes into torrents and made travel treacherous. Tahu led her to a shallow cave in the canyon wall, barely large enough for two people, but dry and sheltered from the wind. They huddled inside as lightning split the sky and thunder echoed off the stone walls like the voices of angry gods. Catherine had never been so close to him in such an intimate space, could smell the scent of leather and sage that seemed to cling to his skin, could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool air. "Cold?" he asked, noticing her shiver. Before she could answer, he was shrugging out of his buckskin jacket, draping it around her shoulders with movements that were both careful and natural. The garment held his warmth, and something else, the indefinable essence of who he was, wild and free and utterly unlike anyone she had ever known. His hand brushed her shoulder as he adjusted the jacket, and Catherine felt something electric pass between them, a current that had nothing to do with the storm outside. She looked up to find his dark eyes fixed on her face, and in their depths, she saw her own longing reflected back. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they simply looked at each other. Catherine was acutely aware of his hand still resting on her shoulder, of the way his breath stirred the hair at her temple, of the fact that she had never wanted anything as much as she wanted to close the small distance between them. Then Tahu stepped back, his face closing like a door, and Catherine felt the loss of his warmth like a physical blow. "The storm is passing," he said, his voice carefully neutral. But something had changed in that cave, something that could not be undone by distance or good intentions. As Catherine rode home through the clearing air, she knew that she had crossed a line from which there would be no return. The proper widow who had entered that cave no longer existed. In her place was a woman awakening to desires she had never known she possessed, and that awakening terrified her more than any storm ever could. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed listening to the house settle around her, Catherine pressed her face into the pillow and wept for everything she wanted and could never have. Outside her window, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods like a voice calling her name, and she knew that despite every rational reason to stay away, she would return to the borderlands again. The trap that was her respectable life had just become a cage, and somewhere in the darkness beyond its bars, freedom waited with dark eyes and gentle hands that had shown her what it meant to be truly seen. The change in Elijah Blackmore's demeanor was subtle, but unmistakable. Where once his pale eyes had held the calculating warmth of a man pursuing a business transaction, now they carried the cold suspicion of someone who sensed his investment was at risk. He began arriving at the ranch unannounced, claiming urgent business with Jeremiah, but spending most of his time watching Catherine with the intensity of a hawk studying a mouse. "You seem different lately, my dear," he said one afternoon as they sat on the front porch, ostensibly enjoying the autumn air. "More distant?" Catherine kept her hands steady as she worked on her embroidery, though every instinct screamed at her to flee from his probing gaze. "I'm sorry if I seem distracted. Elijah, the approaching winter always makes me melancholy. Perhaps what you need is less solitary time." His voice carried the gentle authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I've spoken with your father-in-law about curtailing your riding expeditions. A woman alone on these plains. Well, there have been more incidents lately." The needle slipped, pricking Catherine's finger. A drop of blood stained the white fabric, spreading like guilt made visible. "What incidents?" "Tracks near the Miller place, signs of Indians watching the settlements." His pale eyes never left her face. "Of course, you wouldn't have seen anything unusual during your herb-gathering expeditions, would you?" The question was casual, almost conversational. but Catherine heard the trap hidden within it. Nothing unusual, no. That evening, Jeremiah summoned her to his study. The room smelled of tobacco and leather, masculine scents that reminded her uncomfortably of Thomas and better times. Her father-in-law sat behind his massive oak desk like a judge preparing to render verdict. "Elijah's concerned about your safety," he began without preamble. "These Indian troubles are getting worse. From now on, you'll limit your riding to the immediate area around the ranch, and you'll take Samuel with you." Samuel was the hired hand who helped with the horses. A decent man, but one whose loyalty belonged entirely to whoever paid his wages. Taking him would make any deviation from approved routes impossible to hide. "That seems excessive," Catherine said carefully. "I've never had any trouble." "The decision is made." Jeremiah's tone brooked no argument. "A woman in your position can't afford to take unnecessary risks, especially not when she's about to become the wife of an important man." The walls of the room seemed to press closer, and Catherine felt the familiar sensation of air growing thin. "I haven't agreed to marry Mr. Blackmore." Jeremiah's weathered face hardened. "You haven't refused him either. Time you stopped playing the grieving widow and accepted the opportunity you've been given. There aren't many men willing to take on damaged goods." The words hit like a physical blow, and Catherine gripped the arms of her chair to keep from recoiling visibly. Damaged goods. Is that how they all saw her? A piece of property diminished by use. Lucky to find a buyer willing to overlook her flaws. "I need time to consider," she managed. "Time's a luxury you can't afford. Elijah wants an answer by Christmas. That's 6 weeks. Catherine, use them wisely." As autumn deepened toward winter, Catherine felt herself growing desperate. Samuel accompanied her on every ride, his presence making it impossible to venture beyond the approved boundaries. She found excuses to walk to the root cellar, to check on the chickens, to gather kindling, anything that took her outside where she could scan the horizon for any sign of movement that might be Tahu. But the borderlands remained empty, and she began to wonder if he had moved on, following the ancient patterns of his people toward winter shelter. The possibility that she might never see him again created a hollow ache in her chest that surprised her with its intensity. It was 3 weeks into her virtual imprisonment when opportunity finally presented itself. Samuel came down with a fever that left him bedridden, and Jeremiah was called away to settle a boundary dispute with a neighboring rancher. Catherine seized her chance, saddling Duchess before dawn and riding hard toward the eastern ridge. She found Tahu in a different place this time, a narrow canyon she had never seen before, where a hot spring created a pocket of warmth even as the first snows dusted the higher peaks. He was gathering wood for a fire, and when he saw her approaching, his face showed a mixture of relief and concern that made her heart race. "I thought you weren't coming back," he said simply. "They've been watching me. Elijah suspects something." The words tumbled out in a rush, along with everything that had happened over the past weeks. The restrictions, the pressure to marry, the feeling of walls closing in until she could barely breathe. Tahu listened without interruption, his dark eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames he had coaxed to life. "You should stay away," he said finally. "It's not safe for either of us. I know." Catherine's voice was barely above a whisper. "But I can't. I've tried. But I can't." He looked at her then with an expression that held both tenderness and pain, and she knew he understood exactly what she meant. This thing between them had grown beyond rational control, beyond the boundaries of safety and propriety. It had become as necessary as breathing and just as impossible to stop. "There's something I need to tell you," Tahu said, "about why I was alone when I found you." Catherine waited, sensing the weight of whatever revelation was coming. "I had a family once, a wife named Ayana, and a daughter." His voice was steady, but she could see the cost of the words in the tension of his shoulders. "They were killed during a raid on our winter camp 2 years ago. Soldiers came at dawn, said they were looking for stolen horses. My wife was shot trying to protect our child." The horror of it hit Catherine like a physical blow. She thought of the scar on his face, of the careful way he held himself apart from the world, and understood that he carried wounds that went far deeper than damaged flesh. "I'm sorry," she whispered, knowing the words were inadequate. "I swore I would never care for another woman from your people," he continued. "Swore I would live only for vengeance, until all debts were paid." He looked at her with eyes that held years of accumulated pain. "But then you came, and everything changed." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither dared cross. Catherine felt tears she had been holding back for weeks finally spill over. Not just for his losses, but for the impossible situation they found themselves in. Two people from worlds at war, drawn together by something neither fully understood. "I have to go," she said, but made no move to leave. "Yes." Tahu agreed, but stepped closer instead of farther away. They stood facing each other beside the hot spring, steam rising around them like smoke from a sacred fire. Catherine could see her reflection in his dark eyes, and knew that whatever happened next would change everything. It was then that she heard it, the low rumble of a rattlesnake, somewhere very close. She turned toward the sound and saw the thick, coiled body of a prairie rattler not 3 feet from where she stood. The snake was clearly agitated, its rattle a blur of motion as it prepared to strike. Catherine froze, every muscle in her body locked in terror. She had seen what rattlesnake bites could do, the swelling, the agony, the death that came slowly and without mercy. This far from help. A bite would be a death sentence. Time seemed to slow as the snake drew back, its triangular head weaving hypnotically. Then Tahu was moving, faster than thought, his knife already in his hand as he placed himself between Catherine and the striking serpent. The blade flashed in the firelight, and suddenly the snake's head was severed from its body. The danger ended in one smooth, deadly motion. But Catherine's relief was short-lived. As Tahu straightened from dispatching the snake, she saw him stumble, his face going pale beneath his bronze skin. "Tahu?" She reached for him just as his knees buckled. Looking down, she saw the twin puncture wounds on his wrist where the snake had managed to strike before his blade found its mark. The flesh around the bite was already beginning to swell, and she could see the first dark lines of venom spreading up his arm. "No," she whispered, catching him as he fell. "No, this can't happen." Tahu looked up at her with eyes that were already beginning to lose focus. "The spring," he managed. "Cold water slows the poison." Without hesitation, Catherine half-carried, half-dragged him to the edge of the hot spring where cooler water pooled in a natural basin. She plunged his arm into the cold water, then began doing the only thing she could think of, something she had heard about but never imagined she would have to attempt. Leaning down, she placed her mouth over the bite wounds and began to draw the venom out, spitting the bitter liquid aside before returning to her desperate work. She could taste copper and something else, something that burned her tongue and made her stomach clench with nausea. But she didn't stop, couldn't stop, because the alternative was unthinkable. "Catherine." Tahu's voice was weak but urgent. "You have to go. If they find you here, I'm not leaving you," she said fiercely, pausing only long enough to speak before returning to her task. For the next hour, she worked over him with single-minded determination, drawing out what poison she could and bathing his arm in cold water to slow the spread of what remained. Gradually, the dark lines stopped advancing, and some color returned to his face. By evening, it was clear he would live, though he remained weak and shaken from his brush with death. They sat beside the dying fire, Catherine supporting his weight as he leaned against her, both of them acutely aware of how close they had come to losing something precious before it had been fully found. "You saved my life," Tahu said quietly. Catherine looked down at their joined hands, his dark, scarred, and still swollen from the snake bite, hers pale and trembling with exhaustion. "You saved mine first, from the storm." "That was different. You were a stranger then. And now?" He turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw everything he couldn't say. The longing, the impossibility, the recognition that they had crossed into territory from which there might be no return. "Now you are much more than that," he whispered. And then, as naturally as breathing, he reached up to touch her face. His fingertips traced the line of her cheek, and Catherine felt something deep inside her chest break open like a flower turning toward the sun. When he leaned forward to kiss her forehead, she closed her eyes and allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it would be like to belong to this man instead of to duty and propriety and other people's expectations. "I have to go," she said again, but this time the words held no conviction. "I know," he replied, but neither of them moved. As the stars appeared overhead and the hot spring whispered its ancient songs, they remained as they were, two people poised on the edge of a precipice, knowing that one more step would send them tumbling into territory from which there would be no safe return. But for now, it was enough to sit together in the darkness, to feel the warmth of another human soul who understood what it meant to be trapped between worlds, and to pretend that love alone could bridge the vast distances that separated their peoples. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Tonight, they had this moment of peace, fragile and precious as spun glass, and they would hold it close against whatever storms lay ahead. The morning after the snake bite brought with it a crystalline clarity that made every detail of the canyon seem etched in light. Catherine had stayed through the night, tending to Tahu as the venom slowly worked its way from his system, watching over him as he drifted in and out of fevered sleep. Now, as dawn painted the red rocks gold, she knew she could delay her return no longer. "They'll be looking for me," she said quietly, though every fiber of her being rebelled against leaving. Tahu sat up slowly, testing his strength. The swelling in his arm had gone down, and though he was still pale, his eyes had regained their sharp focus. "Go," he said simply. "But Catherine," she turned back to find him watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. "This changes nothing between us," he said. "What I feel, what we both feel, it's still impossible." Catherine nodded, understanding the wisdom of his words even as she rejected them with her entire soul. "I know." But as she rode back toward the ranch, she carried with her the memory of his hand in hers, of the way he had whispered her name in the darkness, of the moment when their separate loneliness had briefly merged into something larger and more beautiful than either could contain alone. The interrogation began the moment she walked through the kitchen door. Jeremiah stood waiting, his face thunderous, while Elijah Blackmore sat at the kitchen table with the air of a man whose worst suspicions had been confirmed. "Where have you been?" Jeremiah's voice was dangerously quiet. Catherine had prepared for this moment during the long ride home, crafting a story that would account for her absence without revealing the truth. "Duchess threw a shoe near Miller's Creek. I had to walk her back slowly, and it got too dark to risk the trail. I sheltered in the old line shack. Samuel checked that shack this morning," Elijah said smoothly. "No sign you'd been there." Catherine's blood turned to ice, but she kept her expression neutral. "Perhaps he checked the wrong shack. There are several along that route." "Perhaps." Elijah's pale eyes studied her face like a scientist examining a specimen. "Or perhaps you were somewhere else entirely." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Catherine met his gaze steadily, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Mr. Blackmore." "I'm not implying anything, my dear. I'm stating facts. You've been seen, Catherine, riding toward Indian territory, meeting with someone." The words hit like physical blows, but Catherine forced herself to remain calm. "Seen by whom? That hardly matters. What matters is that such behavior stops immediately." Elijah rose from his chair, moving closer until she could smell his pomade and the faint sourness of his breath. "A woman in your position cannot afford even the appearance of impropriety, especially not when that impropriety involves unsavory associations." Catherine felt something cold and hard settle in the pit of her stomach. "I don't know what you mean. Don't you?" Elijah's voice was silk wrapped around steel. Perhaps we should speak privately. Jeremiah, if you would excuse us. Her father-in-law hesitated, clearly torn between his desire to control the situation and his recognition that Elijah held the cards in this particular game. Finally. He nodded curtly and left them alone. Elijah waited until the sound of Jeremiah's boots faded before speaking again. When he did, his voice had lost all pretense of genteel courtesy. I know about the Indian. Catherine, I know you've been meeting with him. What I don't know is how far this association has progressed. Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me. The words cracked like a whip. I have witnesses, reliable men who've seen you talking with a Lakota brave near Willow Creek. The question is, are you a foolish woman who's been manipulated by a savage? Or are you something worse? The insult to Tahu sparked a flame of anger that Catherine struggled to contain. Even if what you're suggesting were true, it would be none of your concern. Wouldn't it? Elijah moved closer, and Catherine caught the scent of whiskey beneath his cologne. I've invested considerable time and effort in this courtship. I've made promises to important men about the kind of woman I intend to marry. I will not be made a fool of by some half-breed's whore. The slap came without conscious thought, Catherine's palm connecting with Elijah's cheek with a sound like a gunshot. For a moment, they stared at each other in shocked silence, the air crackling with violence barely held in check. Then Elijah smiled, and Catherine realized she had made a terrible mistake. There, he said softly, touching his reddened cheek. Now we understand each other. What followed was a careful, methodical destruction of everything Catherine had thought she knew about her situation. Elijah laid out the facts with the precision of a lawyer presenting a case. She was financially dependent on Jeremiah's goodwill. She had no family willing to take her in. Her reputation was already damaged by her unconventional behavior, and now she carried the additional burden of suspected association with Indians. No decent man would have you now, he concluded. Except me. I'm willing to overlook your indiscretions in exchange for complete honesty and absolute obedience going forward. Catherine felt the trap closing around her like iron jaws. And if I refuse, then you'll find yourself with nowhere to go and no means of support. I'm sure you can imagine what becomes of women in such circumstances. His smile was cold as winter frost. Of course, there's also the matter of your Indian friend. It would be unfortunate if the authorities learned of his presence in the area, particularly if they learned he'd been taking liberties with a respectable white woman. The threat was clear, and Catherine felt her last hopes crumble to dust. Elijah held all the power, and he knew it. More terrifying still, she could see in his eyes that he would enjoy using that power to break her completely. I need time to think, she managed. Of course, but not too much time. We'll announce our engagement at the church social next Sunday. 1 week, Catherine. Use it to reconcile yourself to reality. After he left, Catherine sat alone in the kitchen as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the floor. She thought of Tahu, probably wondering why she hadn't returned to their meeting place. She thought of the hot spring where they had shared that moment of perfect understanding, now seeming as distant as a half-remembered dream. The days that followed passed in a blur of numb compliance. Catherine spoke when spoken to, ate when food was placed before her, and performed her household duties with mechanical precision. But inside, she felt herself fragmenting like a mirror struck by a stone, pieces of her essential self scattering beyond recovery. It was on Thursday evening, 3 days before the forced engagement announcement, that the nausea began. At first, she attributed it to stress and the poor appetite that had plagued her since Elijah's ultimatum. But as the symptoms persisted and intensified, a terrible suspicion began to form. She counted the days since her last monthly bleeding, counted them again, and felt the world tilt sideways. 6 weeks. It had been 6 weeks since that night by the hot spring, when grief and terror and desperate love had finally overcome the barriers between them. The realization should have brought panic, should have sent her into the kind of hysteria expected of a ruined woman. Instead, Catherine felt a strange, fierce joy bloom in her chest. Whatever else might be taken from her, she would carry a part of Tahu always. A child conceived in love, if not in wisdom. A living reminder that she had once chosen passion over propriety, had once been fully, completely alive. The joy lasted exactly 3 days. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made every sound carry for miles. Catherine dressed carefully for church, knowing it would be the last time she would appear in public as an unmarried woman. After today, she would belong to Elijah Blackmore completely, would become another possession in his carefully curated collection. She had planned to endure the engagement announcement in silence, to play the role of grateful widow accepting salvation through marriage. But when Elijah rose before the congregation and began speaking of his deep affection for his dear Catherine, something inside her rebelled. "I cannot," she said, her voice cutting through his practiced speech like a blade through silk. The congregation fell silent, every face turning toward her with expressions ranging from shock to scandalized delight. Elijah's pale eyes narrowed to slits, but his smile never wavered. "My dear, you're overwrought," he said smoothly. "Perhaps some air." "I said I cannot." Catherine stood, feeling stronger with each word. "I cannot marry you, Mr. Blackmore. I will not." The silence that followed was absolute. Catherine could hear the wind whistling through the eaves, could hear Mrs. Patterson's shocked intake of breath, could hear her own heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. "Catherine," Jeremiah's voice was a warning growl. "Sit down." "No." She turned to face the congregation, these people who had known her since she was Thomas's shy bride, who had offered condolences at his funeral and gossip at her continued widowhood. "I will not be sold like a piece of livestock to a man who sees me as nothing more than a possession." The explosion of whispers that followed was like the sound of wind through dry leaves. Catherine heard fragments. Shameful, ungrateful, touched in the head, but pushed them aside. She had found her voice at last, and she would not be silenced. Elijah's mask of genteel courtesy finally slipped. "You're making a grave mistake, Catherine, one you'll regret for the rest of your very short, very difficult life." "Perhaps, but it will be my mistake to make." She walked out of the church with her head held high, leaving behind a congregation buzzing with shock and a man whose pale eyes promised retribution. She knew she had just destroyed any chance of a respectable future, had painted herself as an ungrateful, unnatural woman who spurned decent offers of marriage. But as she stepped into the clear morning air, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the intoxicating sensation of freedom. It lasted until she reached home and found Elijah waiting for her in the parlor, his face a mask of cold fury. Jeremiah stood beside him, and Catherine could see that whatever conversation had passed between them had not gone in her favor. "You've embarrassed me," Elijah said without preamble. "Embarrassed my family name, made me a laughingstock." "That was not my intention," Catherine replied, though she couldn't quite bring herself to feel sorry. "Wasn't it?" Elijah moved closer, and Catherine caught the strong scent of whiskey on his breath. "I think you planned this little scene very carefully. I think you're more calculating than you appear." Before Catherine could respond, Jeremiah stepped forward. "She's overwrought," he said heavily. "Women get strange notions sometimes. She'll come around." "Will she?" Elijah's pale eyes never left Catherine's face. "I wonder." "Tell me, my dear, what exactly has you so opposed to marriage? What secret are you protecting?" The question hung in the air like a noose. Catherine felt her carefully constructed defenses crumble as Elijah's gaze bored into her, reading truths she had tried desperately to hide. "Nothing," she whispered. "No?" Elijah smiled, and Catherine knew with sinking certainty that he had guessed the truth. "Then you won't mind if Dr. Morrison examines you, just to ensure you're in good health, you understand? A precaution any caring fiancé would insist upon." The trap snapped shut with brutal efficiency. Catherine closed her eyes. feeling the last of her hope drain away like water from a broken vessel. When she opened them again, she found Elijah watching her with the satisfied expression of a cat that had cornered a mouse. "I thought so," he said quietly. "The question now is, whose child is it, Catherine? And what are you willing to do to protect the little bastard?" The word hit like a physical blow, and Catherine felt something precious and fragile die inside her chest. Whatever happened next, she knew that the woman who had stood up in church that morning, brave, defiant, free, was gone forever. In her place stood someone harder, more desperate, and infinitely more dangerous. The interrogation that followed was methodical in its cruelty. Elijah dismissed Jeremiah with a curt nod, then settled himself in the parlor's largest chair, like a judge preparing to render sentence. Catherine remained standing, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white, while he studied her with the dispassionate interest of a scientist examining a specimen. "Sit down," he commanded. "I prefer to stand." It wasn't a request. His voice carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. When Catherine still didn't move, his expression hardened. "Very well. We'll do this the difficult way." What followed was a careful dissection of her recent behavior, every unexplained absence, every flushed cheek upon her return from riding, every moment when her attention had seemed elsewhere during his visits. Elijah presented each piece of evidence with the precision of a prosecutor, building his case with damning logic. "The morning sickness began approximately 2 weeks ago," he observed. "Doctor, Morrison confirmed it when I asked him to check on your delicate constitution. Combined with your emotional outburst today, the conclusion is inescapable." Catherine felt trapped like a wild animal, cornered by a predator who had all the time in the world to play with his prey. "What do you want from me?" "The truth. Who is the father?" "That's none of your concern." Elijah's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "Isn't it? I've invested months in courting you, made promises to important men about our marriage. Did you think I would simply walk away and allow my reputation to be destroyed by your indiscretions?" He rose from his chair and began pacing the small room like a caged wolf. "Perhaps you thought your secret would remain hidden. Perhaps you imagined you could pass another man's child off as mine after we married. That would have been unwise." The implied threat sent ice through Catherine's veins. "I never intended to deceive you." "No? Then why not simply tell me the truth now?" He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the network of broken blood vessels in his pale eyes, could smell the whiskey and bitter cologne that clung to his skin. "Unless, of course, the truth is so shameful that even you recognize it cannot be spoken aloud." Catherine's silence stretched between them like a taut wire. In that silence, Elijah found his answer. "My God," he breathed, and for the first time, genuine emotion cracked his composed facade. "It's true, isn't it? You've been with that savage." The word hit like a slap, and Catherine felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crumble. "Don't call him that. What should I call him? Your lover, your Indian buck?" Elijah's voice rose with each word, whiskey and rage combining into something toxic. "Do you have any idea what you've done, what you've brought into a decent Christian home?" "I've done nothing wrong," Catherine said, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. "Nothing wrong." Elijah's voice cracked like a whip. "You've lain with a savage, bred with him like an animal, and now you carry his mongrel child in your belly." The blow came without warning, Elijah's palm striking her cheek with enough force to send her staggering. Catherine tasted blood where her teeth cut her inner lip, felt the spreading heat of what would become a livid bruise. "That," Elijah said quietly, his voice once again under perfect control, "is for making a fool of me. This is for carrying another man's bastard." The second blow caught her temple, and Catherine fell hard against the carved wooden arm of the sofa. Pain exploded through her skull, bright and sharp as lightning, and she felt something wet and warm trickling down her face. "Please," she gasped, one hand instinctively moving to protect her abdomen. "The baby." "The baby?" Elijah's laugh was utterly without humor. "You think I care about preserving that half-breed abomination? My dear Catherine, you misunderstand the situation entirely." What followed was a beating delivered with scientific precision. Elijah was careful to avoid her face after the first few blows, focusing instead on her ribs, her back, her stomach. Each strike was calculated to cause maximum pain while maintaining plausible deniability. After all, distraught women often suffered mysterious accidents. Catherine curled into a ball on the parlor floor, trying desperately to shield her unborn child from the rain of blows. Through her pain and terror, one thought repeated like a prayer: this baby was all she had left of Tahu, the only proof that their love had been real. She would endure anything to protect it. But even as she made that silent vow, she felt something warm and wet spreading between her thighs. The cramping started then. Sharp knifing pains that had nothing to do with Elijah's fists and everything to do with her body's inability to sustain life under such brutal assault. "No," she whispered, then louder. "No, please, God, no!" Elijah stopped his methodical violence and stepped back, surveying his work with the satisfaction of a job well done. Catherine lay crumpled on the oriental rug, blood seeping from a dozen cuts and bruises, her face gray with shock and pain. "I trust this has been educational," he said, straightening his cufflinks with the casual air of a man who had just completed a minor business transaction. "You'll find that defying me has consequences, painful ones." Catherine couldn't answer. The cramping was getting worse, and she could feel her body betraying the tiny life that depended on it for survival. Hot tears streamed down her bruised cheeks as she realized that her last connection to Tahu, the child conceived in love and hope, was slipping away like sand through her fingers. "When you've cleaned yourself up," Elijah continued, "we'll discuss the terms of our arrangement going forward. You see, I've decided I still want to marry you. A damaged woman is easier to control than a proud one, and I do so prefer my possessions to be manageable." He left her there on the parlor floor, bleeding and broken, while he went to find Jeremiah and explained that Catherine had suffered an unfortunate accident. Something about stumbling down the stairs in her emotional state. These things happened, particularly to hysterical women who couldn't control themselves. By the time Dr. Morrison arrived, the miscarriage was complete. The elderly physician examined Catherine with professional detachment, asking no questions about the bruises that clearly had nothing to do with a fall. In a territory where women were property and Indians were less than human, certain truths were better left unspoken. "She's lost the child," he told Jeremiah quietly, "not uncommon in cases of severe emotional distress. She'll need rest and quiet to recover fully." Catherine lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling beams Thomas had cut with his own hands, and felt something inside her die along with the child she would never hold. The physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow ache in her chest, the sense that she had lost the last piece of herself that had remained untouched by the ugliness of her situation. For 3 days, she didn't speak, didn't eat the broth Mrs. Patterson brought her, didn't respond to Jeremiah's gruff inquiries about her health, didn't acknowledge Elijah's daily visits to check on his investment. She existed in a gray twilight between waking and sleeping, neither fully alive nor mercifully dead. It was on the 4th morning that the decision crystallized in her mind with perfect clarity. She couldn't stay here, couldn't marry Elijah, couldn't continue this half-life of compliance and quiet desperation. She had lost her child, lost her last connection to the man she loved. But she still had one thing left, the choice of how her story would end. That night, while the household slept, Catherine rose from her bed and dressed in her warmest clothes. She packed nothing except the small amount of money she had saved from her household allowance and the leather-bound volume of Tennyson that had belonged to Thomas. Everything else, the dresses Elijah had insisted she order, the jewelry he had given her as engagement gifts, the life of respectable imprisonment he had planned for her, she left behind without a backward glance. The stable was dark and quiet, but Duchess nickered softly at her approach, as if the mare had been expecting this midnight flight. Catherine saddled her horse with practiced efficiency, her movements sure despite the darkness and the lingering pain from her injuries. As she led Duchess from the stable, Catherine paused for one last look at the ranch house where she had spent the worst months of her life. In the morning, they would discover her gone and assume she had fled in shame, unable to face the consequences of her scandalous behavior. Let them think that. Let them create whatever story they needed to explain her disappearance. She mounted Duchess and turned the mare's head toward the eastern ridge, toward the borderlands where danger and freedom walked together under the stars. She didn't know if she would find Tahu, didn't know if he would still want her now that she carried nothing but grief and damaged dreams. But she knew, with the certainty of a woman who had finally chosen her own path, that whatever awaited her in the wilderness was better than the civilized hell she was leaving behind. The night was cold and full of unknown perils, but Catherine rode toward it with something approaching joy. For the first time in months, she was free. The ride through the darkness was treacherous, the familiar trails made dangerous by shadow and uncertain footing. But Catherine pushed on, driven by desperation and a growing certainty that if she didn't reach the borderlands before dawn, Elijah's men would hunt her down like a runaway slave and drag her back to face consequences too terrible to contemplate. As the eastern sky began to lighten, she finally saw the familiar outline of the red rocks where she had first found refuge with Tahu. Her heart hammered with hope and fear in equal measure as she guided Duchess up the narrow trail toward the hidden canyon. What she found there nearly broke her heart all over again. The shelter was empty, cold ashes marking where Tahu's fire had once burned. For a moment, she thought she had lost everything, that he had moved on, following his people toward winter camps she would never find. Then she saw it, a single eagle feather tied to a juniper branch, positioned where she couldn't miss it. A sign, a message, a promise that he hadn't forgotten her even as he'd been forced to move to safer ground. Catherine clutched the feather to her chest and wept, for her lost child, for the impossible love that had cost them both so much, and for the uncertain future that stretched before her like an unmarked trail through hostile territory. But beneath the grief, something else stirred, something that felt almost like hope. She was free, broken, bleeding, and utterly alone, but free at last. And somewhere in this vast wilderness, a man with dark eyes and gentle hands was waiting for her to find him. The sun rose fully, painting the canyon walls with gold and crimson. And Catherine Whitlow, no longer widow, no longer property, no longer bound by the chains of respectability, rode deeper into the wild country that had become her only sanctuary. Behind her, smoke rose from the chimneys of the settlement where her former life lay in ruins. Ahead lay uncertainty, hardship, and quite possibly death. She had never been happier to be riding toward the unknown. Catherine followed the eagle feather's message deeper into the red rock country, trusting instincts she hadn't known she possessed. For 3 days, she survived on creek water and the few wild berries that hadn't yet succumbed to the approaching winter, sleeping fitfully in whatever shelter she could find among the rocks. Duchess grew gaunt, but the mare seemed to understand the urgency of their flight, pressing on even when the trail disappeared entirely. On the 4th morning, as frost painted the canyon walls silver, Catherine finally found him. Tahu was camped in a narrow gorge where ancient waters had carved fantastic shapes from red stone, creating natural chambers that offered protection from wind and prying eyes. A thin stream of smoke rose from his carefully banked fire, and his paint stallion grazed on the sparse grass that grew near a seep spring. When he saw her approaching, Tahu rose slowly from beside his fire, his dark eyes taking in her bruised face, her torn clothing, the hollow desperation in her gaze. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Catherine slid down from Duchess and simply stood there, swaying with exhaustion and grief, unable to find words for everything that had happened. Catherine? Her name was a prayer on his lips as he crossed the distance between them. When his fingers touched the fading bruises on her cheek, she saw something terrible kindle in his eyes. Who did this? Elijah. The word came out as a whisper. He knows about us, about... She couldn't finish, couldn't speak of the child that was no more. Tahu's face went perfectly still, the way stone goes still before an avalanche. "The baby!" Catherine's composure shattered completely then. She collapsed against his chest, sobbing out the whole horrible story. The confrontation, the beating, the loss of their child, her desperate flight into the wilderness. Tahu held her while she wept, his strong arms the only thing keeping her from falling apart entirely. "I wanted to tell you," she gasped between sobs, "about the baby. I was going to find a way, but then Elijah found out, and he... Shh." Tahu's hand stroked her tangled hair with infinite gentleness. "You're safe now. Nothing else matters." But even as he spoke the words, they both knew they weren't true. Catherine might be temporarily safe in this hidden canyon, but the larger world hadn't forgotten about either of them. Within hours of her disappearance, Jeremiah would have sent word to every settlement within 100 miles. Search parties would be forming, bounties offered, lies told about the innocent white woman who had been abducted by hostiles. "They'll come looking," Catherine said, voicing the fear that gnawed at both of them. Yes, Tahu's voice was grim. But not here, not for a while. Over the following days, as Catherine slowly recovered from her ordeal, Tahu told her what had been happening in his world. The federal government was tightening its grip on the remaining free tribes, offering ultimatums disguised as negotiations: join the reservation system or face military consequences. Many of his people had already given up, trading their freedom for the promise of food and safety. "My brother Running Wolf thinks I should surrender," Tahu said one evening as they sat beside his fire. "He says the old ways are ending, that we must adapt or die." "What do you think?" Tahu was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I think a man can die in many ways. Some take longer than others." Catherine understood. The reservation system wasn't offering life. It was offering a slow death, a gradual erosion of everything that made the Lakota who they were. For a man like Tahu, who had already lost so much, the choice between freedom and safety wasn't really a choice at all. It was on their 6th day together that the cavalry patrol found them. Catherine was washing clothes in the stream when she heard the sound of horses moving through the rocks above. She froze, water dripping from her hands, as voices echoed off the canyon walls. White voices, speaking English, getting closer. She ran back to where Tahu was repairing a bridle, her bare feet silent on the stone. "Soldiers!" she gasped. Tahu was already moving, gathering their few possessions with practiced efficiency. But even as they worked to erase signs of their presence, they both knew it was too late. The hoofbeats were too close, the voices too clear. There was nowhere to run in the narrow canyon, nowhere to hide that wouldn't be found by determined searchers. "Mrs. Whitlow!" The voice boomed off the red rocks like thunder. "This is Captain Morrison of the Territorial Militia. We know you're in there." Catherine felt Tahu's hand close over hers, warm and steady despite the hopelessness of their situation. "I'll tell them you were my prisoner," she whispered urgently. "That you never hurt me, that I escaped on my own." "No." His dark eyes held hers with fierce intensity. "No more lies. Tahu, if we're going to die for loving each other," he said quietly, "then at least let it be for the truth." The soldiers appeared at the canyon mouth like blue-clad angels of vengeance, their rifles gleaming in the morning sun. Captain Morrison was a lean, weathered man with the kind of eyes that had seen too much frontier justice to be surprised by anything. Behind him rode a dozen troopers, their faces hard with the anticipation of violence. "Step away from the Indian, Mrs. Whitlow," Morrison called. "You're safe now." Catherine remained exactly where she was, her hand still clasped in Tahu's. "I am safe, Captain, safer than I've been in months." Morrison's expression didn't change, but she saw his knuckles tighten on his rifle. "Ma'am, I understand you've been through an ordeal. Sometimes captives develop confused feelings about their captors. It's not uncommon." "I wasn't captured," Catherine said clearly. "I came here willingly." The words fell into the canyon like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and disgust among the soldiers. Catherine heard someone mutter "savage lover" under his breath. saw the way their faces hardened from concern to condemnation. "That may be what you believe now," Morrison said carefully. "But trauma can affect the mind in ways you don't understand. Come away from him, and we'll get you the help you need." "The only help I need is to be left alone to live my life as I choose." Morrison's patience was clearly wearing thin. Behind him, the soldiers were growing restless, their horses sensing the tension and beginning to prance nervously. Catherine could see the situation deteriorating, could feel violence gathering like storm clouds. That was when Tahu made his choice. He stepped forward, placing himself between Catherine and the soldiers, his hands raised but his spine straight with dignity. "I am Tahu Red Elk," he said in clear, unaccented English. "This woman is under my protection. She came to me freely, and she has been treated with honor." "Your protection?" Morrison's voice carried dangerous mockery. "A savage's protection. You kidnapped a decent Christian woman, filled her head with lies, and now you expect us to believe she chose this degradation willingly? Believe what you wish." Tahu replied calmly. "But harm her, and you'll answer to me." The threat, mild as it was, proved to be the spark that ignited the powder keg. The soldiers raised their rifles as one, and Catherine saw death approaching with the inevitability of sunrise. "No!" She threw herself forward, placing her body between Tahu and the guns. "If you want to arrest someone, arrest me. I'm the one who chose this. I'm the one who ran away from a respectable marriage to be with him." The confession hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Catherine saw the disgust and condemnation in every face, saw herself transformed from victim to villain in the space of a heartbeat. But she also saw something else. Confusion about how to proceed when the supposedly innocent party insisted on claiming guilt. Morrison holstered his sidearm with visible reluctance. "Mrs. Whitlow, you're clearly not in your right mind. We're taking you back to your family for proper care. As for the Indian..." His pale eyes fixed on Tahu with cold promise. "He'll face trial for his crimes." "What crimes?" Catherine demanded. "Providing shelter to someone in need, protecting a woman from violence. If those are crimes, then half the men in this territory should be in jail. The crime of corrupting a white woman," Morrison said bluntly, "of violating the natural order that keeps civilization intact. There's a name for what he's done to you, Mrs. Whitlow, and there's a penalty for it." Catherine felt ice form in her veins as she understood what Morrison was really saying. This wasn't about kidnapping or even adultery. This was about the ultimate taboo, the mixing of races that threatened everything the white settlers believed about their superiority and their right to this land. "You're going to kill him," she said flatly. "I'm going to see that justice is done." Catherine looked at Tahu, seeing her own desperation reflected in his dark eyes. They both knew what frontier justice meant for an Indian accused of defiling a white woman. There would be a quick trial, if any trial at all, and then a rope and a tree and an unmarked grave. "Then you'll have to kill me too," she said quietly. The words surprised even her, but once spoken, she knew they were true. She had lost her child, lost her future, lost everything except the man standing beside her. If they were going to destroy him for the crime of loving her, then she wouldn't survive to mourn him. Morrison stared at her as if she had grown a second head. "Mrs. Whitlow, my name," she said with perfect clarity, "is Catherine Red Elk. This man is my husband by every law that matters to me. If you arrest him, you arrest both of us. If you try him, you try both of us. And if you execute him..." She let the threat hang unfinished. For a moment, the canyon was absolutely silent except for the wind whistling through the rocks. Then Morrison dismounted, his face grim with the weight of command decisions. "Mrs. Whitlow, Catherine, I understand you think you love this man, but love doesn't change the law. It doesn't change what's right and what's wrong." He approached slowly, hands visible and empty, speaking as if to a frightened animal. "Come back with us. Let the judge decide what's to be done with your husband. Maybe if you testify on his behalf, explain that you weren't forced." Catherine felt hope flicker like a candle flame in wind. You'd let me speak at his trial? If there is a trial, if you cooperate. It was a thin hope, probably false, but it was more than they'd had moments before. Catherine looked at Tahu, seeing in his eyes the same desperate calculation. They both knew the odds were impossibly long, knew that frontier courts rarely showed mercy to Indians accused of crimes against whites, but a slim chance was better than no chance at all. "All right," she said finally. "We'll come with you, both of us, but I want your word that he won't be harmed before the trial." Morrison nodded curtly. "You have it, assuming he comes peacefully." Tahu stepped forward, offering his hands for the shackles. "I will come peacefully," he said with quiet dignity. "But know this, whatever happens to me, this woman chose her path freely. She is guilty of nothing but following her heart." As the iron manacles closed around his wrists, Catherine felt her own heart breaking all over again. But beneath the despair, something else stirred, a fierce determination that surprised her with its strength. They might take Tahu to trial. They might even convict him. But she would not let him face that courtroom alone. Whatever the cost, she would stand beside him and tell the world that love, even forbidden love, was not a crime worth dying for. The ride back to civilization was a journey through hell, but Catherine faced it with her chin raised and her hand reaching toward the man she loved, even when the chains between them made touching impossible. They were going to fight for their love in the one place where it had no chance of winning, a courtroom where white law would judge red hearts, and where the price of defiance was measured in lives. But they would fight together, and somehow that made even the impossible seem worth attempting. The territorial courthouse in Pine Ridge was a squat building of rough-hewn timber and stone that seemed to crouch against the prairie like a predator waiting to spring. Catherine had seen it many times during her years as Thomas's wife, but never imagined she would enter it as the central figure in a drama that would determine whether the man she loved lived or died. Tahu had been held in the basement jail for 2 weeks while territorial officials debated how to proceed with a case that had no clear precedent. The legal system was designed to handle simple crimes: cattle rustling, claim jumping, the occasional murder over cards or women. It was not equipped to deal with a situation where the supposed victim insisted she was a willing participant and demanded to be tried alongside the accused. "You can't be serious about this testimony," Judge Harrison Blackwood said, studying Catherine across his desk with the weary expression of a man who had seen every form of frontier madness. "You understand what you're claiming? The implications?" Catherine sat rigidly upright in the hard wooden chair, her hands folded in her lap with deceptive calm. "I understand perfectly, Your Honor. I'm claiming that I entered into a relationship with Tahu Red Elk of my own free will, that I was never coerced or threatened, and that any crimes committed were committed by both of us equally." Judge Blackwood was a heavy-set man with silver whiskers and intelligent gray eyes that had watched the territory grow from wilderness to something approaching civilization. He had presided over claim disputes and murder trials, had sentenced horse thieves to hang and claim jumpers to prison. But this case challenged every assumption about law, order, and the proper relationships between the races. "Mrs. Whitlow," he said carefully, "I've known your family for years. Your late husband was a decent man. Your father-in-law is respected in the community. What you're describing, it goes against everything you were raised to believe." "Yes," Catherine agreed quietly. "It does." "Then why? Why throw away your reputation, your future, your place in decent society for this?" The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Catherine thought of all the ways she could answer, with pretty lies about temporary madness, with excuses about loneliness and poor judgment, with the kind of feminine weakness that men expected and would forgive. Instead, she chose truth. "Because I love him, Your Honor, because in all my life, I have never been seen so clearly by another human being. Because when I'm with him, I become the person I was meant to be instead of the person others expect me to be." Judge Blackwood leaned back in his chair, studying her with something approaching fascination. And you believe that justifies breaking the fundamental laws that hold our society together? I believe love justifies almost anything, Your Honor, and I believe those laws are wrong if they prevent people from choosing their own happiness. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this conversation. Catherine saw the judge's face tighten with something between admiration and alarm, and knew she had just voiced the kind of dangerous ideas that territorial officials spent their lives trying to suppress. The trial will begin Monday morning, Judge Blackwood said finally. I suggest you use the remaining days to reconsider your position, what you're proposing. It won't end well for either of you. Catherine stood, smoothing her worn skirts with hands that trembled only slightly. With respect, Your Honor, it ended badly the moment we fell in love. At least this way. We faced the consequences together. The weekend that followed was a blur of preparation and desperate hope. Catherine had been allowed to stay at the Pine Ridge boarding house under the watchful eye of Mrs. Graham, the sheriff's wife. While the territorial prosecutor built his case and the court-appointed defense attorney tried to convince his clients to accept a plea bargain that would save their lives, if not their freedom. Transportation to Oregon Territory, Attorney Samuel Morris explained, mopping his brow with a handkerchief despite the autumn chill. Both of you. You'd have to live as man and wife. Never return to Wyoming, and accept supervision for 5 years. It's more than generous. Considering what? Catherine asked. Morris shifted uncomfortably, considering that most men in Red Elk's position end up decorating a tree limb without benefit of trial. Catherine felt ice form in her stomach. You're saying they want to lynch him. I'm saying there are men in this territory who see the mixing of races as a crime worse than murder. Judge Blackwood is trying to find a legal solution that avoids extra-legal remedies. That evening, Catherine was finally allowed to visit Tahu in his cell. The basement jail was a stone-walled chamber that smelled of dampness and despair, lit by a single kerosene lamp that cast dancing shadows on the rough walls. Tahu sat on a narrow cot, his wrists still bearing the marks of shackles, his proud bearing unbroken despite the circumstances. You shouldn't have come back, he said quietly as she approached the bars. I couldn't leave you to face this alone, and now we'll both face it. His dark eyes held hers through the iron bars. Catherine, there's something you need to understand. Even if we survive this trial, even if we're allowed to leave this territory together, there will be no peace for us. No place where we can simply be husband and wife without constantly looking over our shoulders. Catherine reached through the bars to touch his hand. I know. Do you? Do you really understand what you're giving up? You could still change your testimony, claim I forced you, accept Blackmore's offer of marriage. You could have a normal life. With a man who beats pregnant women? Catherine's voice was sharp with remembered pain. Living a lie for the rest of my days? That's not life. Tahu, that's just existing. They sat in silence for a moment, hands clasped through the cold iron, each drawing strength from the other's presence. Outside, they could hear the sounds of Pine Ridge settling into evening, horses clopping past on the main street, the distant sound of piano music from the saloon, the ordinary sounds of a world that had no place for their extraordinary love. Tell me about the mountains, Catherine said suddenly. Tahu's eyes softened. Which mountains? The ones you told me about, where your grandmother took you when you were small, where the elk come to drink and the eagles nest in the high rocks. For the next hour, Tahu painted word pictures of a land beyond the reach of territorial law, where streams ran clear and cold from snow-covered peaks, where a man could build a cabin in a hidden valley and live according to his own conscience rather than society's rules. As he spoke, Catherine could almost see it, the two of them working side by side to build a life in the wilderness, free from the hatred and prejudice that made their love a crime. It was a beautiful dream, and they both knew it might be the last one they would ever share. Monday morning dawned gray and cold, with the kind of wind that cut through wool and chilled the bones. The courthouse was packed to capacity. every seat filled with settlers eager to witness what promised to be the most sensational trial in territorial history. Catherine had never seen such a crowd. Ranchers and miners, shopkeepers and saloon girls, even a few Lakota who had traveled from the reservation to watch one of their own face white man's justice. The prosecutor, District Attorney William Hayes, was a thin man with pale eyes and a voice like a preacher delivering sermons about damnation. He opened his case with a speech about the sacred bonds of civilization, about the natural order that separated the races, about the corruption that threatened to destroy everything decent people had built in the wilderness. "Gentlemen of the jury," he declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom, "we are not here to judge a simple case of adultery or even kidnapping. We are here to defend the very foundations of Christian society against the forces of savagery and moral corruption." He painted a picture of Catherine as a victim of savage cunning, a decent woman whose natural feminine weakness had been exploited by a man who used her loneliness and grief to lure her into degradation. He spoke of Tahu as a predator who had violated not just Catherine, but the natural order itself, committing crimes against civilization that demanded the ultimate penalty. When Attorney Morris rose to present the defense, he faced a hostile crowd that had already heard everything they needed to make up their minds. His strategy was simple: admit to an improper relationship, but claim it was mutual, emphasize Tahu's service as a scout for the army, and hope that evidence of good character might save his client from the rope. But it was Catherine's testimony that transformed the trial from a simple criminal proceeding into something approaching a philosophical debate about the nature of love, law, and human dignity. She took the stand wearing her simplest dress, her auburn hair pulled back severely, her hands steady as she placed them on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. As she looked out at the sea of hostile faces, she felt a strange calm settle over her. This was her moment to speak not just for herself and Tahu, but for everyone who had ever been told their love was wrong. "Mrs. Whitlow," Morris began gently, "please tell the court how you came to know the defendant." Catherine's voice was clear and steady as she told the story, the storm that had brought them together, the growing friendship that had blossomed into something deeper, the moment when she had chosen to follow her heart instead of society's expectations. She spoke without shame or apology, describing their relationship as a meeting of souls rather than a crime against nature. "Were you ever threatened or coerced by Mr. Red Elk?" Morris asked. "Never. Every choice I made was my own." "Including the choice to leave your guardian's home and live with him in the wilderness?" "Yes. I went to him freely because I could no longer bear the life that had been planned for me." Prosecutor Hayes rose for cross-examination like a vulture sensing carrion. "Mrs. Whitlow, you claim you entered into this relationship willingly. But isn't it true that you were in a vulnerable state after your husband's death? Grief-stricken, perhaps not thinking clearly?" "My thinking was never clearer," Catherine replied firmly. "And yet you abandoned Christian civilization to live like a savage in the wilderness? You call this clear thinking?" Catherine felt anger flare in her chest, but kept her voice level. "I call it choosing love over convenience, truth over respectability." Hayes pressed harder, trying to get her to admit she had been manipulated, seduced, or otherwise victimized. But Catherine refused to give him what he wanted, insisting again and again that she had acted of her own free will. "Mrs. Whitlow," Hayes said finally, his voice heavy with disgust, "do you understand that what you're describing is not love but depravity? That by mixing your blood with that of a savage, you've violated the natural law that separates civilized people from animals?" The courtroom fell silent, waiting for her response. Catherine looked out at the sea of faces, some curious, some condemning, some afraid, and saw reflected there all the prejudice and hatred that had made their love impossible. "Mr. Hayes," she said quietly, "I've seen more humanity in that so-called savage than I've seen in most of the civilized men I've known. If loving him makes me depraved, then I choose depravity over the kind of civilization that would hang a man for the crime of being loved." The words fell into the courtroom like lit matches into dry tinder. Catherine heard gasps of outrage, muttered curses, the scraping of chairs as people shifted uncomfortably. She had just articulated the unthinkable, a direct challenge to the racial hierarchy that underpinned territorial society. When Tahu took the stand in his own defense, he spoke with the same quiet dignity that had first drawn Catherine to him. He admitted to the relationship but refused to apologize for it, describing Catherine as a woman of courage and intelligence who had chosen her own path despite enormous pressure to conform. "Do you love this woman?" Morris asked. "More than my own life." Tahu replied simply, "Enough to die for her." Tahu looked directly at Catherine, and she saw in his dark eyes all the tenderness and strength that had sustained her through the darkest days of her life. "Enough to live for her," he said, "if the court allows it." The closing arguments were predictable. Hayes demanding death for the crime of racial mixing, Morris pleading for mercy and transportation. But Judge Blackwood's instructions to the jury were unprecedented in their complexity, asking 12 white men to decide not just guilt or innocence, but the very nature of love itself. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, their faces were grim with the weight of their decision. Catherine held her breath as the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. "Guilty of unlawful cohabitation," he announced. "But we recommend mercy in sentencing due to unusual circumstances." It wasn't freedom, but it wasn't death either. Judge Blackwood sentenced them both to transportation to Oregon Territory, with the understanding that they would be married by a territorial chaplain and supervised for 5 years. They would lose everything, their past, their families, their place in the world, but they would have each other. As the gavel fell and the courtroom erupted in a mixture of outrage and relief, Catherine felt Tahu's hand find hers. They had won something precious, the right to face an uncertain future together. It wasn't the ending either of them had dreamed of, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, Catherine thought as they were led away to begin their new life in exile, a beginning was enough. The journey to Oregon Territory took them through country that seemed carved from the very bones of the earth. High mountain passes where snow fell even in summer, deep forests that had never known the bite of an axe, and valleys so remote that their footprints might have been the first human marks in the soil. For Catherine and Tahu, traveling under the watchful eye of Federal Marshal James Crawford, it was both exile and liberation. They had been married by a territorial chaplain the morning after the trial, a brief ceremony conducted in the courthouse with only Marshal Crawford as witness. The words were legal and binding, but they held little meaning compared to the vows they had already made to each other by firelight in hidden canyons. Still, the simple gold band Tahu placed on Catherine's finger felt like a declaration of victory against all the forces that had tried to keep them apart. Strange honeymoon, Catherine observed one evening as they made camp beside a mountain lake that reflected the stars like scattered diamonds. Tahu looked up from the fire he was building, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Not what you imagined when you were a young girl dreaming of marriage." "No," Catherine admitted, then added with fierce conviction, "but I wouldn't trade it for anything." Marshal Crawford, a weathered man in his 50s who had spent more years in the wilderness than in civilization, had initially viewed his assignment with distaste. Escorting a white woman and her Indian husband to exile was not the kind of duty that enhanced a lawman's reputation. But as the weeks passed and he observed the quiet devotion between his charges, his attitude began to soften. "Never seen anything like it," he confided to Catherine one morning as they prepared to break camp. "The way you two look at each other reminds me of my Ellen before the consumption took her. Makes a man think about what really matters in this world." They reached the settlement of Cedar Falls in late October, when the aspens were painting the mountainsides gold and the first serious snows were dusting the high peaks. It was a rough logging town of perhaps 300 souls, isolated enough that territorial authorities hoped the controversial couple could disappear into anonymity. The cabin they were assigned sat on the outskirts of town, a 2-room structure of chinked logs with a stone chimney and windows that looked out on forest stretching to the horizon. It was simple, remote, and the first real home Catherine and Tahu had ever shared as husband and wife. It's perfect, Catherine breathed, standing in the doorway and imagining the life they could build within these walls. But perfection, they quickly learned, was harder to maintain than to achieve. The other settlers viewed them with suspicion at best, outright hostility at worst. Catherine was shunned by the women at the general store, ignored by the wives of other logging families, treated as a curiosity or an object of pity, depending on the observer's temperament. Tahu faced worse. The logging crews refused to hire him despite his obvious strength and skill with tools. Storekeepers served him grudgingly and charged inflated prices. Children were hurried to the other side of the street when he approached, as if his very presence might contaminate them. "We can make it," Catherine insisted as their savings dwindled and winter approached with frightening speed. "I can take in sewing, maybe teach reading to the children who—" "What children?" Tahu asked gently. "What parents in this town would allow their children near us?" The truth was painful but undeniable. They were pariahs in a place where survival depended on community cooperation. Without acceptance from their neighbors, they faced a winter that might prove their last. It was then that salvation came from an unexpected source. Joseph Crowfeather was a Nez Perce who had left his tribal lands years before, establishing a small ranch in a high valley 20 miles from Cedar Falls. He arrived at their cabin on a crisp November morning, driving a wagon loaded with supplies and wearing the kind of smile that suggested he brought good news. "Heard about you two from Marshal Crawford," he said without preamble. "Figure you could use some friendly faces about now." Joseph was perhaps 40 years old, with intelligent dark eyes and hands that spoke of a lifetime spent working with horses and cattle. His wife, Mary, was a Shoshone woman who had fled an arranged marriage to build a life with the man she loved. Their 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, had inherited the best features of both parents and the kind of confidence that came from being raised without shame about their mixed heritage. "There are others like us," Mary explained as they shared dinner in the cabin that had suddenly become warm with friendship. Couples who couldn't find acceptance in the white world or the Indian world. "So we made our own." She spoke of a small community of mixed families scattered throughout the high valleys. People who had chosen love over convention and were building lives based on mutual support rather than racial purity. It wasn't a large group, perhaps a dozen families at most, but it was a community where Catherine and Tahu might finally belong. "The land is hard," Joseph warned. "Winters are long, growing seasons short, but it's ours, and we look out for each other." The decision was easy. Within a week, Catherine and Tahu had packed their few possessions and followed Joseph's wagon into the mountains, toward a valley where eagles nested in the high rocks, and a small group of outcasts had created something approaching paradise. The Crowfeather Ranch sat in a natural amphitheater surrounded by snow-capped peaks, with a clear stream running through pastures where horses grazed and children played without fear. Other cabins dotted the valley floor, each representing a family that had chosen love over societal approval. There was William Tree Walker, a Cherokee who had married a German immigrant named Greta, and their twin daughters who spoke 3 languages fluently. Marcus Stone, a former Buffalo soldier who had found love with a Ute woman named Dancing Bird, farmed the richest soil in the valley and served as the community's unofficial leader. The Yakima woman called Singing Waters lived with her Irish husband Patrick O'Malley and their 4 sons, raising horses that were renowned throughout the territory. Each family had a story of exile and redemption, of love that had cost them everything they thought they wanted in exchange for everything they truly needed. Together, they had created something unique in the American West, a place where the color of a person's skin mattered less than the content of their character. Catherine and Tahu built their new home on a rise overlooking the stream, a larger cabin than the one they had left behind, with windows that caught the morning sun and a porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the deer come down to drink. They worked side by side, Catherine learning to split shingles and chink logs, while Tahu mastered the mysteries of her cooking and sewing. The physical work was hard but satisfying in ways that surprised them both. When Catherine drove nails into roof beams or Tahu prepared meals over their hearth, they were not just building a house, but creating a life that belonged entirely to them. No one in this valley questioned their right to love each other. No one suggested that their marriage was anything less than sacred. Spring brought new challenges and new blessings. A late freeze killed many of their seedlings, forcing the entire community to share resources to prevent hunger. Catherine proved invaluable during the crisis, her education allowing her to serve as teacher for the valley's children, while her growing knowledge of wild plants helped supplement their diet during the lean weeks. It was during that difficult spring that Catherine discovered she was pregnant again. The news came as both joy and terror. She had lost one child to violence and hatred. The thought of risking another in this harsh land filled her with dread. But when she told Tahu, his face lit up with such pure happiness that her fears began to dissolve. "A child born free?" he whispered, his hands gentle on her still flat stomach. "A child who will know only love and acceptance." Mary Crowfeather became Catherine's guide through the pregnancy, sharing the wisdom of generations of women who had given birth in wild places. The other women in the valley rallied around her, creating baby clothes and furniture, sharing stories and advice, treating her not as an outsider but as a cherished member of their extended family. Summer passed in a blur of preparation and contentment. Catherine's belly grew round with new life, while their garden flourished under Tahu's careful tending. They spoke often of the future they were creating, not just for themselves, but for the child who would inherit this valley and the freedom it represented. It was in early September, when the aspens were just beginning to turn and the first light snows dusted the highest peaks, that the crisis came. Catherine was hanging laundry behind their cabin when she noticed the smoke. At first, she thought it was just one of the neighbors burning brush, but as the column of black smoke grew thicker and closer, she realized with growing horror that it was coming from the direction of the Crowfeather Ranch. By the time she and Tahu reached the main settlement, half the valley was in chaos. A lightning strike had ignited the forest on the eastern ridge, and the wind was driving the fire directly toward their homes. Men were already forming bucket brigades while women gathered children and precious possessions. But everyone could see that their efforts were pitifully inadequate against the wall of flame advancing through the trees. "The children!" Mary Crowfeather gasped as she stumbled past carrying her youngest son. "Some of the children were playing in the upper meadow when it started. We can't find them." Without hesitation, Tahu grabbed a wet blanket and headed toward the smoke-shrouded forest. "Which way?" he called over the roar of approaching flames. "The old deer trail," Joseph shouted back. "But Tahu, the fire's moving too fast." Catherine caught her husband's arm. "I'm coming with you." "No, not in your condition. Those children are lost and frightened. They'll trust me more quickly than they'll trust you." She wrapped her own wet blanket around her shoulders, her face set with determination. "We do this together or not at all." There was no time to argue. Together, they plunged into the burning forest, following the faint trail that led to the high meadow where the children had been gathering late berries. The smoke was so thick they could barely see each other, and the heat pressed against them like a living thing. They found the children, 3 of them, the youngest barely 5 years old, huddled together beside a fallen log, too terrified to move as the fire closed in around them. Catherine scooped up the smallest while Tahu gathered the other 2, and together they began the desperate race back towards safety. The return journey was a nightmare of smoke and flame, falling trees and paths that disappeared in the choking haze. Catherine's pregnancy made her clumsy and slow, but she refused to put down the child she carried even when her lungs burned and her legs trembled with exhaustion. They were perhaps 100 yards from safety when Catherine stumbled over a hidden root and fell hard, her body instinctively curling around the child in her arms to protect him from the impact. Pain shot through her abdomen, sharp and wrong, and she knew with sinking certainty that the fall had damaged more than just her pride. "Catherine?" Tahu was beside her instantly, his face gray with smoke and terror. "Take the children," she gasped. "Get them to safety. I'll follow." But even as she spoke the words, she could feel warmth spreading between her thighs, could feel her body betraying the life it carried for the second time. The pain was different from before, not the sharp agony of violence, but the deep, inevitable ache of loss. Tahu saw the truth in her eyes. For a moment, he seemed torn between saving the children and staying with his wife. Then training and instinct took over. He gathered all 3 children in his powerful arms and ran toward the safety of the valley floor, trusting that Catherine would find the strength to follow. She did follow, driven by love and determination, stumbling through smoke and flame until she collapsed at the edge of the fire line. The other women gathered around her, their faces tight with understanding, while the men continued fighting the blaze that had already cost them so much. By morning, the fire had burned itself out against the natural barrier of the stream, leaving a blackened scar across the eastern ridge but sparing most of their homes. The children Catherine and Tahu had rescued were safe and whole, reunited with their grateful families. But the price of that rescue lay heavy in Catherine's heart as she sat beside the window of their cabin, watching Tahu bury another child who would never draw breath. The loss was different this time, not born of hatred and violence, but of love and sacrifice, but no less painful for being noble. "The children are safe because of what we did," Tahu said quietly as he returned from the small grave he had dug beneath the aspens. Catherine nodded, tears streaming down her soot-stained cheeks. "I know, but I wanted our child to see this place, to grow up free and loved." "Perhaps," Tahu said, taking her hands in his smoke-blackened ones. "Perhaps some gifts are too precious for this world to hold. Perhaps our children live on in the love we give to others." As autumn deepened into winter and the valley healed from the fire's scars, Catherine found wisdom in her husband's words. She threw herself into teaching the surviving children, helping them rebuild what had been lost, creating beauty and knowledge in place of the dreams that had burned away. And on clear nights, when the stars shone like scattered diamonds above the peaks, she would sit on their porch with Tahu's arms around her and feel something like peace settle in her heart. They had lost much: children, homes, the easy certainty of youth, but they had gained something rare and precious. They had found a love strong enough to survive exile, a community that valued hearts over heritage, and a place where 2 people from different worlds could build something entirely their own. It was not the ending either of them had imagined when they first met in a storm-lashed canyon, but it was an ending they had chosen together. And that choice, Catherine thought as she watched the eternal dance of stars above their mountain home, was perhaps the greatest victory of all. In the distance, an eagle called from the high rocks, and Catherine chose to hear in that wild cry not a lament for what was lost, but a celebration of what remained, 2 hearts beating as one beneath the endless western sky. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this tale of forbidden love on the frontier. Catherine and Tahu's story reminds us that true love knows no boundaries, even in the harshest of times and places. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to this story? Are you gathered around your own campfire, perhaps? Or listening from the comfort of your home while dreaming of wide-open spaces? Please subscribe to Wild West Campfire and share your thoughts about this story of love that dared to defy the world. Until next time, may your own trails lead to happiness, wherever they may wind.